In 1989, a janitor found a hidden hatch in a bank basement. Inside was a skeleton in a suit and a small tape recorder. The janitor's name was George, and he had worked at the Merchant Trust Bank for 30 years, long enough to know the building's every sound and smell. He knew the groan of the pipes in winter, the scent of old paper and dust that clung to the lower levels, and the precise squeak of the third step on the service stairs. But this smell was new. It was faint, but deeply wrong. It was the smell of decay, not of paper or damp concrete, but of something organic that had been sealed away from the world for a long time. He found it in the far corner of the secondary basement, a storage area that hadn't been used since the bank digitized its records. A threadbare, mildewed carpet lay over the concrete floor, a remnant from a time when this room was perhaps an office. George was only down there because the bank was preparing for a deep clean before a merger, and everything had to be inventoried or thrown out. He was rolling up the stiff, rotting carpet when his foot snagged on something. It wasn't a tear in the fabric. Underneath, flush with the concrete, was a square of steel with a recessed ring handle. It was a hatch. He had never seen it before. In 30 years, he had walked over this spot thousands of times, and he had never known it was there. Curiosity, stronger than his urge to just get the job done, took over. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and worked his fingers into the ring. It was stuck fast with rust and grime. He stood up, went to his cart, and came back with a crowbar. With a grunt and the shriek of tortured metal, the hatch popped open. The smell that billowed out was overwhelming, a thick, putrid air that made him gag and step back. He fanned the air with his hand, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He peered into the dark opening. It was a small, tight space, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet square, lined with brick, and at the bottom, there was something. He retrieved his heavy-duty flashlight from his cart. The beam cut through the darkness, and George's breath caught in his throat. It was a person, or what was left of one. A skeleton, fully clothed in a dark, rotting suit, lay curled on its side. The fabric was shredded and stained, clinging to the bones like a second skin. One skeletal hand rested near a dusty leather briefcase. The other was outstretched, the bony fingers curled around a small plastic cassette recorder. George stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth. The flashlight beam trembled, dancing across the grim scene. The skull was turned toward the opening, the empty eye sockets staring up into the dim light of the basement. He didn't scream. The shock was too deep for that. He just turned, dropping the flashlight, and ran, his squeaking shoes echoing in the sudden, terrible silence of the basement. The police arrived within the hour, their presence a stark, modern intrusion into the forgotten corner of the bank. The yellow tape went up, creating a small, official island of horror in the vast, dusty room. The forensics team, in their sterile white suits, looked like visitors from another planet as they descended into the tiny, hidden chamber. They documented everything with a quiet, methodical precision that felt both respectful and chilling. The suit was identified as a standard men's business suit from the 1980s. The briefcase was locked, but the leather was so brittle it fell apart when they tried to move it. Inside, there were no bundles of cash, just stacks and stacks of stock certificates, their paper yellowed and smelling of the grave. The certificates were for tech companies that had boomed and then busted. They were worthless. The team carefully bagged the skeleton, bone by bone. But the most important discovery was the small tape recorder still clutched in the skeleton's hand. It was an object that held a potential voice, a story from beyond the grave. Later that week, dental records confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Alan Price, a 34-year-old clerk who had worked at this very bank. He had vanished 2 years earlier, in the fall of 1987. At the time, his disappearance had made a small splash in the local news before fading away. The official theory, the one whispered by his colleagues and even some in law enforcement, was that he had run. Alan had disappeared on October 20th, 1987, the day after the stock market crash that would come to be known as Black Monday. The world had woken up to financial chaos, and Alan Price, a quiet, unassuming man with a wife and a young son, had simply walked out of the bank at the end of the day and never been seen again. A search of his finances had revealed he was deeply in debt, having invested his family's entire savings, and then some, in the very stocks that were now just worthless paper. The conclusion was simple and sad. He couldn't face the ruin, so he abandoned his life. His car was found at a bus station a week later. It was a clean, logical story. Except for one person who never believed it: his wife, Sarah Price. For 2 years, she had insisted that Alan would never run. He was not a coward. He loved her. He loved their son, Leo. He would have faced any storm, she said, as long as he had them. But no one listened. She was just a grieving wife, lost in denial. Now, with the discovery in the basement, her lonely belief was horribly vindicated. Alan hadn't run. He had died here, just a few floors below where he had once sorted ledgers and stamped papers, trapped in a secret hole in the ground. The question was no longer where he went. The question was how he got there, and who had left him to die. Alan Price had loved the quiet predictability of his life. He loved the way his wife, Sarah, hummed when she made coffee in the morning. He loved the weight of his 5-year-old son Leo falling asleep on his chest while they watched cartoons. He loved the neat rows of houses in their suburban neighborhood, the trimmed lawns and the sense of order. The bank, too, was part of that order. It was a world of numbers, of balance sheets and ledgers, a place where everything had to add up. He found comfort in that. But in the months leading up to October 1987, a different kind of number had captivated him. The soaring numbers of the stock market. It felt like a secret code to a better life, a way to get ahead, to give Sarah the kitchen she dreamed of, and to start a college fund for Leo that would guarantee his future. A colleague, a charismatic trader from the investment division, had convinced him it was a sure thing. So Alan took their savings. Then he took out a second mortgage on their small house. He didn't tell Sarah about that part. It was meant to be a surprise, a grand gesture. He imagined the look on her face when he would reveal their newfound wealth. On the morning of Monday, October 19th, he woke up with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. The market had been jittery the week before. He kissed Sarah and Leo goodbye, the lie of his secret weighing on him. At the bank, the atmosphere was tense. The ticker machines, usually just background noise, were the center of everyone's attention. The numbers were all red. They were falling, not just dipping, but plummeting. By midday, it was a full-blown crash. Alan felt the blood drain from his face. He sat at his desk, pretending to work, but his mind was a storm of falling numbers. He saw his savings, Sarah's dream kitchen, Leo's future, all of it turning to dust on a screen. He felt a cold, creeping dread that was worse than any fear he had ever known. It wasn't just the money, it was the shame. He had gambled with their life, with their trust. How could he ever face Sarah? After work, he didn't go home. He called her from a payphone, his voice tight and unnatural. He told her he had to work late, a big project, an inventory. It was a clumsy lie, and he knew she heard the strain in his voice. She said, okay. She'd keep dinner warm. I love you, she said. I love you too, he replied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He hung up the phone and stood there in the autumn chill, the city lights blurring around him. He felt trapped, cornered by his own foolishness. He went back to the bank. The building was quiet now, most people having fled the financial carnage. But he wasn't there to work. He was there to meet someone. Someone who had offered him a way out. A desperate, dangerous plan to fix what he had broken. He walked through the marble lobby, his footsteps echoing like a judgment. He took the staff elevator down to the basement, his heart pounding against his ribs. He never came back up. Sarah waited all night. She kept his dinner warm in the oven, then put it in the fridge. She watched the late news, her stomach churning with a vague sense of dread. At midnight, she called the bank. No answer. She called his colleagues. No one had seen him since 5. By morning, she knew something was terribly wrong. The police were kind but dismissive. A man in financial trouble, a car at a bus station. It was a familiar story. They told her to prepare herself for the fact that he might not be coming back. She refused. She told them about Alan, about his love for his son, his deep sense of responsibility. They nodded sympathetically and filed their report. The world moved on, but Sarah's world stopped. Her husband was gone, and she was left alone with a 5-year-old boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home, and a secret shame that wasn't even hers. The neighbors started to look at her with pity, then with suspicion. The story solidified. The quiet bank clerk who embezzled money and ran. Sarah felt the walls of their small house closing in on her. She was a widow, but without a body, without a proof of death. She was trapped in a limbo of grief and uncertainty. For 2 years, she fought to keep his memory alive, to defend his name to anyone who would listen. And then, one rainy afternoon in 1989, 2 detectives knocked on her door. They told her they had found Alan. They told her where. And the limbo she had been living in was replaced by a cold, hard, horrifying reality. Her husband had been there all along, just miles away, in the dark, silent basement of the bank. The detective sat in Sarah's living room, the same living room where Alan used to play with Leo on the floor. They looked uncomfortable, out of place among the family photos and crayon drawings taped to the wall. They had the tape recorder with them, sealed in an evidence bag. Detective Miller, a gruff, older man with tired eyes, did most of the talking. He explained that the medical examiner couldn't determine a precise cause of death due to the advanced decomposition, but the circumstances were clear. No signs of a fight, no broken bones, no wounds. The likely cause was dehydration and starvation. He had been locked in and left to die. The horror of that sank into Sarah, a cold weight in her chest. She imagined Alan, alone in the dark, calling for help, his voice growing weaker and weaker. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image. The second detective, a younger man named Rossi, cleared his throat. He said, "We have the tape from the recorder he was holding. We think you should hear it, or at least read the transcript." He handed her a few sheets of paper. Sarah's hands trembled as she took them. The words were typed out, sterile and black on the white page, but as she read, she could hear Alan's voice in her head. The recording was short, only about 3 minutes long, and fragmented. It started with the sound of labored breathing, a desperate, rasping sound. Then his voice strained and filled with a terror she had never heard before. Sound of scratching. "It's so dark. I can't see. He locked me in. He said he'd be back. He promised." Long pause, more breathing. "The air is getting thin. I think it's been a day. Or 2. The voices. I keep hearing voices in the walls, whispering. They know I'm here. They're laughing." A sob, then a sharp intake of breath. "Mr. Glass." That's what he called himself. Mr. Glass. He said it was foolproof. "Just hide the certificates until the market settles. He said we'd both be rich." Fool. I was a fool. Sound of something thudding against a wall, weakly. "Hello?" Is anyone out there? Please. I have a son. My wife. Sarah. The voice breaks down into quiet, desperate sobs. The walls. They're talking about me. They're saying my name. It's him. It's his voice. He's out there. He's listening. The recording ended there. Just the faint sound of scratching, and then silence. Sarah stared at the transcript, the words blurring through her tears. Voices in the walls? Mr. Glass? It sounded like the ravings of a man losing his mind, driven mad by fear and darkness. Detective Miller sighed. Look, Mrs. Price, it seems clear what happened. Your husband got involved in an embezzlement scheme with this Mr. Glass. They planned to steal the stock certificates. Alan's job was to hide them in this secret vault. But his partner betrayed him, locked him in, took the key, and left him there to die, probably planning to come back for the loot later. The problem was, the stock market crash made the certificates worthless, so his partner never had a reason to return. A perfect crime, almost. Sarah looked up, her eyes flashing with a spark of anger through her grief. So you're just going to dismiss what he said? The voices? Detective Rossi shifted in his seat. With all due respect, ma'am, he was trapped in a dark hole, dying. He was likely hallucinating from lack of oxygen and water. It's tragic, but it's not supernatural. The real clue here is the name Mr. Glass. The investigation kicked into gear with a new focus. They were no longer looking for a runaway. They were hunting a killer. They scoured the bank's employee records, past and present. They searched financial databases, criminal records. They were looking for anyone connected to Alan, anyone at the bank, with the name or nickname Glass. They found nothing. No one by that name. No known associates. They interviewed dozens of Alan's former colleagues. Most remembered him as a quiet, dependable worker who kept to himself. No one recalled him being close to anyone. Certainly not someone who might have a cryptic nickname. The trail went cold almost as soon as it began. The case was reclassified as a homicide. Victim Alan Price. Suspect unknown. But without any new leads, the file was placed in a cabinet with other unsolved cases, gathering dust. The story, for the police, was over. A tragic tale of greed and betrayal with a dead end. But for Sarah, it was just the beginning. The phrase from the tape echoed in her mind, a constant, haunting refrain. Voices in the walls. The police might have dismissed it as a dying man's delusion, but to her, it felt like a clue. It was the one part of the story that didn't fit their neat theory, and she clung to it like a life raft. The years that followed were a blur of quiet grief and simmering obsession. Sarah raised Leo, who grew from a sad little boy into a quiet, watchful teenager who rarely spoke of his father. On the surface, she was a single mother, working a secretarial job to make ends meet, going to parent-teacher conferences, packing lunches, but underneath, she was a detective. Her dining room table was no longer for family meals. It was her investigation headquarters. She had managed to get a copy of the complete case file through a persistent records request. The photos of the scene, the forensic reports, the transcript of the tape, it was all there, spread out before her. She pinned a large map of the bank's layout, obtained from the city archives, to a corkboard. Red string connected photos to locations, notes to timelines. She read the tape transcript every single night before bed. Voices in the walls. It wasn't a metaphor, she decided. It had to be real. Alan wasn't a poet. He was a literal, factual man. If he said he heard voices in the walls, he meant it. She became convinced the police had missed something physical, something about the location itself. The bank building had been sold during the merger and was now mostly vacant, slated for eventual demolition. On weekends, she would go and just stand across the street, staring at it. She studied the old blueprints she'd gotten from the archives, memorizing the layout of the basements, the positioning of the vaults, the paths of the plumbing and electrical conduits. She needed to understand the space where he died. She started trying to track down former employees herself. Most were retired, scattered across the country. She wrote letters, made phone calls. Most remembered nothing useful. They remembered the shock of Alan's disappearance and the horror of the discovery years later, but no details. No Mr. Glass. No secrets. Then, after months of dead ends, she got a call back from a woman named Eleanor, a retired executive secretary who had worked at the bank for 40 years. Eleanor's memory was sharp as a tack. "Mr. Glass?" she said, a thoughtful pause on the other end of the line. "No, I don't remember anyone with that name. But you know, it's funny. There was a senior manager back then, a man named Arthur Finch. A real cold fish. We girls used to have a little nickname for him behind his back. We called him Mr. Glass because you could see right through him, but you could never tell what he was thinking. He was just blank, hard." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Arthur Finch. She remembered the name from the employee roster in the case file. He had been a vice president in the commercial loans department, several levels above Alan. The police had interviewed him briefly, but he had an alibi for the night. Alan disappeared. A dinner with clients, and he claimed to barely know Alan. He was dismissed as a person of interest. "This Arthur Finch," Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What happened to him?" "Oh, he did very well for himself," Eleanor said. "Got a big promotion after the merger. Retired a few years later. A very wealthy man. Moved to Florida, I think. A wealthy man. A cold man. A man called Mr. Glass." It was thin, so thin it was barely there, but it was the first new thread she'd had in years. She went back to the evidence photos, spreading them across her table. Her eyes scanned every detail, every shadow, and then she saw it. Something she, and apparently the police, had overlooked. Lying in the dust near Alan's skeletal hand was a small object, metallic and dark. It was mostly obscured by a fold in the rotting suit fabric. In the official report, it was listed as an unidentified metal fragment. But looking at it now, with fresh eyes, Sarah saw its shape clearly. It wasn't a fragment. It was a key. It was too small to be a door key or a vault key. It looked more like a key for a locker or a post office box or a safe deposit box. A new wave of energy surged through her. A nickname and a key. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She now had two things to look for: a man who was good at hiding things, and a lock that this small forgotten key might open. The investigation consumed her. Leo grew up in the shadow of the corkboard in the dining room. He learned to tune out his mother's late-night phone calls and the rustle of her papers. To him, the investigation wasn't a noble quest for truth. It was the thief that had stolen his mother as surely as a secret vault had stolen his father. He loved her, but he resented the ghost that she chased, a ghost that had more presence in their house than he did. Time moved on. The 1980s became the 90s. The 90s became the 2000s. The world changed. Technology evolved. But Sarah's quest remained frozen in 1987. Arthur Finch, she discovered, had passed away in 2005. A heart attack on a golf course in Florida. He had died a respected member of his community. His secrets, if he had any, buried with him. It felt like another dead end, another door slammed shut. The bank building, a grand old structure of marble and brass, continued its slow decay, a monument to a bygone era. It was an eyesore for the city, a prime piece of real estate tied up in legal battles. Then, One evening in 2010, Sarah saw a story on the local news. The legal battles were over. The Merchant Trust Bank building was scheduled for demolition. Crews would begin work within the month. A panic seized her. It was her last chance. The building held the final answers. She was sure of it. The key, the voices in the walls. The truth was in there. And soon it would be turned into a pile of rubble. She had to get inside one last time. This time, she wouldn't go alone. She called Leo. He was a grown man now, an architect, with a life of his own. A life he had carefully built as far away from his mother's obsession as possible. He answered the phone, his voice wary. "They're tearing it down, Leo," she said, her voice urgent. "The bank. I have to go inside." "Mom, no," he said, his voice weary. "It's over. Let it go. The man is dead. There's nothing there." "There's a lockbox, Leo. I know it. The key from the photo. It has to open something in that basement." Alan said he heard voices in the walls. Not in his head. In the walls. "Please, just this one last time." He could hear the desperate plea in her voice. The same plea he'd been hearing his whole life. He had always said no before, but this time was different. This was the end of the line. If he said no, she would try to go alone, and she would get hurt or arrested. Maybe if he went with her, if they found nothing, she could finally let it go. "Okay, Mom," he sighed, the words tasting like defeat. "Okay, I'll go with you." A week later, they stood before the condemned building, surrounded by chain-link fences and demolition signs. Sarah had managed to get permission from the demolition company foreman, a surprisingly sympathetic man who had heard her story. They had 2 hours before the interior gutting of the basement began. They put on hard hats and stepped through a side entrance into the dusty gloom. The main lobby was a skeleton of its former self, wires hanging from the ceiling, the marble floors covered in a thick layer of grime. Leo looked around with an architect's eye, seeing the ghosts of what it once was. Sarah, however, had tunnel vision. She led him straight to the service stairs, down into the basement. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. The secondary basement was even worse. Debris was everywhere, but the corner where Alan had been found was still recognizable. The outline of the hatch was still visible on the floor. "The police searched this whole area, Mom," Leo said gently. "They didn't find anything. They weren't looking for the right thing," she whispered, her eyes scanning the brick walls that surrounded the spot. She pulled the crumpled blueprints from her pocket, her flashlight beam dancing across the old paper. "He was here," she pointed to the hatch. "The main vault was over there. The walls between them are thick. But," she ran her hand along the grimy brickwork of the wall closest to the hatch. Alan was a numbers man, a literalist. Voices in the walls. She started tapping on the bricks one by one. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was solid dead. Leo watched her, a familiar ache of pity and frustration in his chest. This was madness. Thud, thud, thunk. The sound was different, hollow. Sarah froze. Her breath hitched. She tapped it again. Thunk. It was a loose brick. Her fingers, trembling, scraped at the old mortar around it. It crumbled away. She worked her fingertips into the gap and pulled. The brick slid out with a gritty scrape. Leo stepped closer, his own heart starting to beat faster despite himself. He shone his phone's flashlight into the dark cavity. It wasn't empty. Tucked deep inside the wall was a small, gray metal box, the size of a book, a safe deposit box. On the front was a small, simple lock. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished key. It was a copy she'd had made years ago, based on enlarged images from the crime scene photo. She had carried it with her every day for almost a decade. With a shaking hand, She inserted the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. She turned it. There was a soft, metallic click that echoed in the vast, silent basement like a gunshot, a sound that broke 23 years of silence. They took the box home. They didn't open it in the car or on the sidewalk. They sat at the dining room table, the corkboard, with its faded photos and red string still hanging on the wall behind them, a silent testament to Sarah's long vigil. Leo looked at his mother. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but her eyes were clear and focused. This was the moment her entire life had narrowed down to. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside, there were two items: a small ledger with a worn black cover, and another cassette tape. Leo felt a chill run down his spine. He went and found an old Walkman in a drawer, one he hadn't used since he was a teenager. He put the tape in, and they both put on headphones, sharing the earbuds, their heads close together. He pressed play. The tape hissed for a moment, and then a voice filled the silence. It was not Alan's frantic, terrified voice. This voice was calm, controlled, and laced with an icy arrogance. It was the voice of Arthur Finch. "If you are hearing this," the voice began, "it means I'm dead, and you, Sarah, have been even more resourceful than I gave you credit for. I suppose I owe you an explanation. Think of it as a final balancing of the books." Leo glanced at his mother. Her eyes were closed, tears streaming silently down her face. Finch's voice continued, cold and matter-of-fact, as if dictating a business memo. "The crash in '87 was a disaster for many, but for me, it was an opportunity. I had been skimming from dormant accounts for years, a little here, a little there, but the crash provided the perfect cover for a much larger withdrawal. I needed a scapegoat, a patsy. Your husband, Alan, was perfect. A good man drowning in debt, desperate. I made him an offer. I told him I had a plan to use the chaos to our advantage, to secure stock certificates that would rebound in value. He was to take them from the reserve vault and hide them in the old sub-basement hatch. I told him we would lay low for a year, then split the profits. He believed me. He was so desperate to fix the damage he had done to your family that he would have believed anything." The voice paused, and the sound of liquid being poured into a glass could be heard. "He did his part perfectly. He got the stocks, went to the hatch. I met him there. I helped him lower the briefcase in. Then he climbed down to arrange them. As he looked up, I simply closed the hatch. He started shouting, 'Of course.' I told him I would be back. A lie, naturally. The stocks were already becoming worthless. The plan was a bust. But he was the loose end. He couldn't be allowed to talk." Sarah let out a small, choked sob. Leo reached out and took her hand, his own knuckles white. "The most amusing part," Finch's voice continued with a hint of a chuckle, "were the voices in the walls. The day after I locked him in, I went back. Not to free him, of course, but I was curious. I went into the main vault, the one adjacent to his little tomb. The walls are thick, but not completely soundproof. I stood there, by the wall, and I spoke to him. I told him he was going to die there. I told him how I had used him. I described the meal I was going to eat that evening. He screamed and begged. It was clarifying. So you see, your husband wasn't hallucinating, Sarah. He was hearing the truth. He was hearing his killer's voice right through the wall." Finch's confession went on, detailing how he had created the false trail, how he had sold the embezzled assets and built his new life. He expressed no remorse, only a cold, detached pride in his own cleverness. The tape ended with a final, chilling statement. He died for nothing, a miscalculation. But in the end, business is business. The books are balanced. The tape clicked off. The silence that filled the room was heavier than any sound. It was the weight of a truth held for 23 years. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the black ledger on the table. Leo opened it. Inside, in Finch's neat, precise handwriting, was a detailed accounting of every dollar he had stolen, every transaction, every secret account. It was all there. The proof, the whole ugly story. There would be no trial, no courtroom justice. Arthur Finch had died a free, wealthy man, his crimes known to no one. But as Sarah looked at the ledger, at the tape player, she felt a profound sense of release. It wasn't about vengeance. It was never about vengeance. It was about his name. It was about freeing Alan from the prison of lies that had been built around his memory. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't a thief who ran. He was a good man who made a mistake and was manipulated by a monster. He was a victim, a hero in his own tragic way, who had tried to save his family. Leo looked from the ledger to his mother's face. He saw the years of pain, of obsession, fall away from her. For the first time since he was a little boy, he saw his mother, not the grieving detective, but just his mother. He finally understood. Her fight hadn't been an obsession that stole her from him. It had been an act of profound love that kept his father's spirit alive. A few days later, they gave the box and its contents to the police. The case of Alan Price was officially closed. His death was ruled a homicide, perpetrated by Arthur Finch. Alan's name was cleared. In the local paper, there was a small article, a correction to a story decades old, a final balancing of the books. That spring, Sarah and Leo stood in a quiet cemetery before a new headstone. The simple plaque that had marked an empty grave for years was gone. In its place was a proper stone of polished granite, Alan Price, beloved husband and father. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new grass. The long winter of not knowing was finally over. The truth hadn't brought happiness, but it had brought peace. A quiet, bittersweet peace that settled over them like the soft morning light. The secret that had echoed through their lives was finally silent. Did this story remind you of a case where the truth took decades to surface? Let us know your thoughts below.